Right, peace be with you all. Thank you for being present with us today, or for folks who may be watching this video recording at a later point. My name is Rashid Shabazz. I'm on the board of directors for the Alameda Museum, as well as the chair of the Events and Exhibitions Committee. And really grateful for you all for joining us for our virtual speaker series. This 2022 series is called A People's History of Alameda, of course, pulling from the Howard Zinn text with a similar title. And this month, from September 15th to October 15th, is Latino or Hispanic Heritage Month. And so we wanted to use the Heritage Month themes to organize our speaker series for this year as an effort to expand the stories that are being told about Alameda's history. I'm very grateful for our speaker tonight. I have known him for a number of different years, for quite a little time in our time on this earth, and just really grateful for what he's already shared with me in his life, but what he'll be sharing this evening. And so, before I introduce our speaker, I first want to just find out a little bit about folks who have tuned in and that are present right now on September 19th, 2022. So if folks can just share in the chat, you already shared where you all are listening from and participating from, but if you could share something that you're interested in learning about, something that you're curious about learning about, please just add that to the chat right now. And so again, this program is going to be definitely inspired by some of your interests. And so as I continue, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the land where the Alameda Museum is located. And although this is a virtual program, many of us live on, work, play, and pray on the unceded land of the Chochenyo speaking Ohlone people. And it's called Alameda by the state or by many of us, but it's also known as Huchin. And so you're also welcome to add another name of the place that you're calling in from. And so many folks have put some of the names of the places that they're listening from, but we also know there's other names that have oftentimes been replaced, repurposed in the colonial project that's in North America and beyond. So the purpose of the land acknowledgement, which is not actually land back, but it's to acknowledge the land and the people who have been its caretakers and continue to care for the land. And it's also part of a practice of the step towards truth, because too often people have places maybe named after them after they have been removed from the land. And so recognizing in Alameda, this land was never ceded, it was taken, it wasn't given. And there have been harms that have been enacted on indigenous people here. In fact, in the city of Alameda, the streets are literally paved with the remains of indigenous people. And so with that, I want to encourage y'all to again share anything you're curious about. We'll definitely be incorporating that into the program. And so my screen that had George's bio has just disappeared. So I'm gonna see if I can find that real quick, and then I'm gonna just go right into it. I'm gonna go with a short bio for now, and perhaps I can get a little bit more information about some of your history and work as we go along. And so George Galvis is the Executive Director of Communities United for Youth Restorative Justice, also known as CURYJ. And he'll be leading our conversation today. And for nearly 30 years, George has been involved with promoting restorative justice. And as a co-founder of CURYJ, again pronounced courage, he draws from his personal experiences and his indigenous roots to help young people, particularly those involved in the criminal justice system, become community leaders for positive change. So without any further ado, welcome, George.
Right on. Thank you, brother Rashid. Really just humbled and honored by the invitation. Thank you, everybody who joined. And I guess maybe the way to kind of kick it off is, so this is Latino Heritage Month. This is, and I think maybe we should just kick it off with some identity politics, the term Latino. Like, let's deconstruct that. You know what I mean? Because there's a whole, you could talk from folks like, generally Latino, everybody understands as kind of being people from Latin America and the Caribbean, but there's just so much debate. There's so many kind of folks who get emotionally charged by all these different identities, and sometimes just kind of being lumped in this big kind of umbrella. You know what I mean? And I think the first thing we should just kind of note is that Latino is an ethnic identity. It's not a racial identity. And, just like in the context of the United States, in every Latin American and Caribbean nation, there's a lot of racial diversity. And just like the United States, there are racialized caste systems. And so the term Latino, generally refers, and really the origin of the term, as most people understand it, is based on these Latin language European colonial nations coming and invading, the Turtle Island, the Americas, the Caribbean, and it feels kind of absurd for a whole identity, an ethnic identity and label sometimes to be kind of premised on that, right? So it's Latino Heritage Month. The irony is I've always had issues with the term Latino, and Latinx isn't necessarily better for me. I appreciate certainly like the efforts of a lot of our folks who are really trying to be more gender expansive. But nevertheless, the term Latin, the term Latino, Latina, Latinx, for me, it ultimately erases African and Indigenous identities. And yet, majority of the Spanish speaking world these days are people who are mixed and people who are of African and Indigenous descent, right? And so, other terms that people have tried to impose are like sometimes, and we can kind of get into like the comparative analysis of how some may be more problematic than others. For example, the term Hispanic, Hispano literally means Spaniard. And it was a term that the Nixon administration used to really try to label everybody who was coming from a Spanish speaking nation. But there was also very much a feeling based on sort of the time, like the social political landscape at that time, that it was very much an intentional effort to really undermine a lot of these kind of racial justice and social justice movements associated with some of these communities. You had a very vibrant Boricua movement, New Yorkers and Puerto Ricans of, from Chicago, New York, the Young Lords Party, and their traditional homeland, Borinquen, which is the origin of why they identify as Boricua, Chicano, and the term Chicano. And, I've heard lots of different explanations, but really the one that was really passed on to me that makes the most sense is that it was really an abbreviated version of Mexicoyat. And when the Spaniards came and invaded, and as we know, part of the colonization process was basically rape and pillage, and the rape of our Indigenous women, those children, the offspring of those who were mixed with our Indigenous women and the Spanish colonizers were basically, that abbreviated term was applied to them, and that became Chicano. And it really was sort of a derogatory term for really until the 60s and 70s, when it became something that was reclaimed as an affirmation, something to be proud of, because it was associated with being working class and Indigenous. And that became very much, something consistent with and a badge of pride almost, of embracing, similar to the way the LGBT community embraced the term queer, that had been something that had a derogatory and stigmatizing application in the past, but was reclaimed. And so there's the term Chicano. And then, a lot of folks will also tell you that they prefer to be referred to based on sort of their nation or national origin, Salvadoreño, Nicaragüense, Peruano, Colombiano, all of these different sorts of examples. And ultimately, we need to acknowledge that all of those are basically colonial constructions whose borders were sort of arbitrarily drawn and militarily imposed. So is that really something that we want to embrace widely? Like, I'm just not a nationalist, you know what I mean? And so, so it becomes a very complicated question at least in my view. Others may feel very comfortable and be very clear about what they're, what they're comfortable with in terms of identity, but it becomes very challenging from my perspective. And what we need to acknowledge too is that, going back to that racialized caste system, is that in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, there were so many racial categories. Like, here in the United States, we had what was referred to as the one drop rule. If you were one drop of African descent, one drop of indigenous descent, then you were otherized automatically, and you were native, or you were indigenous, or you were you were considered quote unquote Black. And in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, the colonialism process looked a little different, and it was very, very colorist. And so you could actually move up based on phenotype. And so the thing that you'll see is a lot of sort of internalized colonialism, people who may be of African descent within Latin America, who will deny their African roots because of the fear of being discriminated against, because of the shame, because of that internalized colonialism, and similarly with indigenous descent. And now we're starting to see in younger generations, once again, a reclamation of some of those identities and some pushback on some of those old colonial sort of paradigms and narratives. So I wanted to kind of kick it off, like, let's just talk about identity for a moment. So I hope I didn't piss too many people off, but let me go ahead and pause there, Brother Rashid, and see if there's any follow-up questions.
I think that's a great way to kick it off, whether that's pissing people off, or or disrupting some of the ideas that may already exist. I think one thing that was, for me, that was really interesting in hearing you really take a global perspective on this identity that's connected to colonization and language, is also the specific, I guess maybe nationalist manifestations. So you mentioned, like, Puerto Ricans and Boricua movement, and then Chicano, and I know that was maybe more prominent on the West Coast and Southwest, maybe Chicago as well. Not as familiar with that Midwest history, but I'm curious if you could start to get into some of maybe a little bit more local histories, and so specifically thinking about California and Bay Area.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me kind of begin first before I transition to kind of more of a local kind of a framework, though, is, there's also, I would refer to it as sort of a false dichotomy. But one of the things I think that's important to, acknowledge, particularly here in the West Coast and in our local communities, is this assumption that quote unquote Latinos, Latinx folks are generally mestizo people who are mixed with Spanish and indigenous blood, and a denial particularly of the African influence. Like, oftentimes when we refer to Black and Brown, we refer to them, as sort of distinct from each other. You know what I mean? Oh, Black folks and Latino folks, or, you know what I mean? And I think that reflects some of the unfortunate anti-Blackness we see here, but also I think because there was more of that African influence in the Caribbean areas and in certain nations, where there's maybe more prominence of folks in the East Coast and in certain parts of the country, and not as much in the in the West Coast. It's reinforced these false narratives. And what you'll see is Afro-Colombianos who, after the second generation, if they don't identify as Latino, they identify as Black in the context of the United States. Similarly, you'll see some Cubans and some Puerto Ricans, and Garifinas from Honduras and other, other folks of African descent who will identify as Black after one generation and no longer identify as Latino because of, because of some of those dynamics and the way that they're perceived, the way they're received. And I think also because of some of the anti-Blackness that we frankly, see manifest itself even within the Latino community. You know what I'm saying? So, here locally, I think, to sort of one of the references that you made earlier, Brother Rashid, is, oftentimes people will sort of pop their collar or kind of lift up or raise up all these different sorts of ways that we have Spanish names, Vallejo, California, right? Alameda, and, parks, Parauta, and all these different things. that are in the Spanish language as sort of a badge of pride. But what folks often won't necessarily take time to actually um, deconstruct and acknowledge is that those were all Spanish invaders. Those were essentially the slave masters, you know what I'm saying? For indigenous people here in California, you know, and that really began with the California mission system, you know. Slavery here in California is older than America. And, you know, and it got reinforced, frankly, by the gold rush and the experience of many California indigenous people. And, you know, many California indigenous people began to sort of assimilate because of the red codes of 1850 and would either mix with a lot of the Mexican or Chicano families, you know, along with a lot of the Pinoy and Filipinos. Many of them were working in the fields in the agricultural industry later on. But before that, because of the policy of exterminate them here in California and of the legacy of greed, gold, and genocide, many California indigenous peoples began to identify as Mexican in order to avoid the persecution, because, you know, legalized slavery occurred as a result of the 1850 red codes. If you were a California indigenous person criminalized for being quote unquote vagrant after your land, your traditional homeland was stolen, now you're being labeled as vagrant and you know, and landless. As a result of those colonial policies, it became legal, and they framed it in a very sort of, you know, flowery way to make it seem like, oh, well, they're going to be under the caretaking of these miners, these gold miners, and these other folks for their own good, their own benefit, and they're going to be taught to work and to assimilate. But actually, what took place was the rape of indigenous girls and women, California indigenous girls and women, and you know, the genocide and really sort of brutality of many of the boys and men who were relegated to doing some of the most dangerous jobs in the gold mining that included mercury and the, you know, which is highly toxic, and explosions and you know, and those kinds of things. And it's even reflected like at UC Berkeley, right? Our oldest, most prestigious, you know, public university here in California, that's right here in the East Bay, and certainly, you know, proximate to the city of Alameda. You know, Ishi, you know, who was a Yana Nation from up there in, you know, Shasta County, was basically a slave of the anthropologist Kroeber. You know what I mean? So I think we need, you know, like ultimately at the end of the day, Brother Rashid, like at the risk of pissing some people off, I believe in truth. You know what I mean? And so I just think it's important that we call things for what they really are. Let's stop kind of, you know, sugarcoating it, using this kind of, you know, flowery language or whatever to just try to minimize the real impact. What it was, you know, is that was legalized slavery right here in California, despite Californians thinking and popping our collars and thinking about California exceptionalism, wagging our finger at those southern states, you know what I'm saying? Now that was right here in California. And the red codes became really the foundation and its inspiration for the black codes in the South later on.
Wow, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that history. Just for folks who may be a little bit more interested in this, what some call hidden history of slavery. Recently, the ACLU of all organizations had a project called Gold Chains, and it was talking about this history of enslavement in California, and of course, it extended beyond just the mission system. So I think that overview, right? I think you gave a very great framework, global framework, thinking about again colonialism, North America, but also this diaspora of people who were included in this category of this ethnic identity of Latino or Latinx or Latin. You know, it's evolved related to gender and some other ideas, and then thinking about colonization specifically in California and the mission system as one of the tools, a military tool that, and so then getting to some of the local history. And so I'm wondering if you can speak, just maybe first start with San Francisco and then come across the Bay to California.
Yeah, one
I'm
interesting.
sorry, not California, to Oakland, California.
Yeah. And one interesting thing, just in terms of origins of terms, you know, that was really kind of brought over as well as a result of the gold rush is the term cholo. like when you think of cholo now, you think of the homie with the hairnet, with the Pendleton creased out, maybe, rocking some Cortezes or some winos, slippers, you know what I'm saying? And kind of rooted in kind of this Pachuco culture, right? That
Maybe a
was
hat like that.
right with rocking a brim like that, right? You know what I'm saying? Or maybe even down like this, you know what I'm well, if we really doing it lowrider style, you feel me? But yeah, so the term cholo comes from Peru. It comes from South America. That was a term that the Spaniard used similar to Chicano to refer and sort of in a derogatory way to the indigenous people. And so when these criollos, which means criollo meaning people of basically Spanish descent living in Latin America, right? All those folks you see on Telemundo and Univision, some of them might also be mestizo, but they certainly trying to whiten themselves up. But, you watch, Telemundo, Univision, you'll see, the reflection of, the anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, because you'll be like, God damn, there's a lot of blonde hair, white folks, you know what I'm saying? And, and that's because of those legacies of colonialism and racism that still exist there, right? And so the criollos being of Spanish descent, they were, some of those criollos from Peru were brought over here because, they were already very skilled in gold extraction. That was something that was taking place in Peru, even before the US. And so they came out here to train some of the gold miners on gold mining extraction and techniques. And they brought over the term cholo because when they saw Mexicans and they saw brown skinned people that were more indigenous in their features, that was the term that they used. And that became the term that Anglos adopted and began to also apply towards brown skinned folks that were more indigenous in appearance. So, that came, and the gold rush and its origins to San Francisco, you could say that's a Bay Area term for real. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, that's applied, all over the place, all over the Southwest, and then things like the burrito, right? People always think that was something from Mexico. A lot of people don't realize that's a California thing too, man. And it also comes from sort of the ranchos here in the Southwest, including here in the Bay. And, you had these Spanish landowners, right? People like the Peralta Hacienda right here in Oakland. And the indigenous people were essentially enslaved, and they would, at the end of the day, get all the leftovers of what the patron, the slave master, ate and which was whatever that was. If they had some steak and some rice and some beans and some salad or whatever they ate, you know what I mean, was just wrapped up in a big tortilla, and that was given to them. You know what I mean? So it was considered quote unquote peasant food. You know what I'm saying? Now you got gourmet burritos and you got white folks paying, $15, $18 in the Mission for a burrito. You know what I'm saying? Or sometimes they call them wraps now, right? Gentrification's a mother, you know what I mean? But, I just think it's interesting for people to also just kind of know some of these origins, right? Also, the assimilation, kind of like the violent policies of assimilation and hegemonization and synthesization, go back, just like I can think about just my mother's generation. My mother is a product of San Francisco Unified School District, as am I. I moved out here to Oakland, to the East Bay in '96. But did all of my public education until I got expelled and incarcerated, and all that. But the rest, majority of my public education, was San Francisco Unified. So at the time that my mom was a student at San Francisco Unified School District, and she was, you would be corporally punished, hit with a ruler if you spoke Spanish in the classroom. Teachers, principals, administrators, counselors, they didn't, they would hit you with a ruler and you would be doing lines on the chalkboard. And so a lot of the parents from my mom's generation felt like they were doing their kids a favor by not really cultivating bilingual capacity and bicultural capacity. So there was really a push for assimilation. It wasn't until a little bit of backlash. And frankly, I think when we start talking about like Chicano power movement, Los Siete de la Raza, and all these kind of things that kind of sprung up here in the Bay, we have to acknowledge that the inspiration of that actually came from Black power movement. It came through the Black civil rights movement, Cesar Chavez and the farm worker struggle were very much inspired by Dr. King. Cesar's, the way he embraced sort of nonviolent, philosophy was very, was the Kingian philosophy was very much inspired by Dr. King, and the more radical movements of the Brown Berets and other groups later on, very much inspired by who? The Black Panther Party, right? And so, you're beginning to see folks push back on some of that violent hegemonization and synthesization and start to take pride in who they are, and that's, Los Siete de la Raza, for anybody who doesn't know, like that's historic right here in the Bay, in terms of Raza, history. They were folks who were, from El Salvador, Nicaragua, Mexico. We had a lot of Central American refugees who started coming out here into the Bay in the 60s and 70s, and they were just moving from a friend's house, and lo and behold, they get racially profiled. That's not a new thing. And the police come and they pull out a gun. One officer, an officer ends up being killed, not by these guys, but it was basically so-called friendly line of fire. One officer, in his panic based on his racism, right? Get it? Hispanic. So, little play on words there. Anyways, he drew his gun and he ended up shooting his partner on accident. And then they try to blame it, gaslight these brothers, these 7 dudes, and that became Los Siete de la Raza, right? They were being charged with the murder of a police officer. And it became a kind of a rallying call, and it mobilized the San Francisco Mission District, even Eastside Daly City Mission District, folks from all over the Bay, from Oakland, from everywhere, were organizing and mobilizing to free Los Siete de la Raza. And that was a big thing. The term La Raza really became the dominant term to refer to all these different groups in the 60s and 70s. So if you go to San Francisco State, they used to have a La Raza studies program, right? They had a club that was La Raza Unida, right? And the reason being is that we had so many folks representing El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala and all these other places of origin, Boricua, and La Raza was kind of embraced as sort of an all-encompassing term because it literally translates to, the race, but that's not really the translation. It really translates to the people, right? And so that, and if you look at every sort of indigenous nation in almost all, in almost all across every tribal community, the translation of their name usually translates to the people, right? And so La Raza kind of being more of the, of a Spanish sort of representation or manifestation of that for people who are Spanish speaking, felt very appropriate. But, at some point in time, some folks began to feel like, oh, La Raza, that's a Mexican thing. That's just Mexicanos, right? And there was kind of pushback on that. And somehow Latin or Latino became, more inclusive. But once again, I've already kind of expressed some of my concerns with those terms in terms of the erasure of Black and Indigenous people. So, yeah, that's a little more history in terms of the Bay, kind of a little more localized. And then, one of the questions I see in the chat in terms of like sort of the demographics and the raza in Alameda, Alameda is, do they even have that many people? Well, historically they didn't, and they still don't have a lot. And the reason being was very much intentional and by design. You didn't see a lot of people of color, period, because of racial covenances, right? That restricted and did not allow Black, Indigenous, and people of color to move into Alameda. Alameda was kind of like a sanctuary city for working class white folks. You know what I mean? That didn't want Oakland to be, and what Oakland as a Black and brown, kind of a community that became, quote unquote, ghettoized. They didn't want that creeping in there. And that's even manifested by more recent terms when our district attorney, Nancy O'Malley, is on public record in the Alameda Planning Commission during the time that they were getting ready to construct an in and out right across the Broadway tunnel, saying, and she came in opposition against in and out, saying, we don't want Oakland. We don't want Oakland coming into Alameda. Well, what do you think that's code word for when she's saying Oakland? And that's our district attorney. So that can tell you we got an old Irish racist district attorney who's finally retiring, but that's who's been out here in Alameda County prosecuting Black and brown folks.
to share a little bit more about that, the context in Alameda, well, thank you first for your responses, George. I was asked this question once before by Alameda a high school student in Alameda, actually at Island High, and she asked, "What about Latinos?" And one of the things I think I don't think there's been much work around this, if anything, historically. And I think another thing comes back up to this question around identity. And so when you look back at like census records, right? You can go to this website, Bay Area Census, and when you look for people who are now categorized as Latino, when you go to 1950, the earliest when it is broken down by racial groups, it says white persons of Spanish surname. And
Yep.
so in 1950, there were 1,300 white persons of Spanish surname. And this begins to evolve over time. Then it becomes white Spanish surname, persons of Spanish origin or descent. And then finally, 1990 is Hispanic. And so, again, disaggregating, those different racial groups within this category that's based around language and the last name, right?
Yeah.
Regardless, I mean, we know many Black people in the United States, for example, have European names because we were kidnapped and
Mhm.
brought here, right? And
That's
so,
right.
how do you, distinguish that? But with that said, yeah, beginning as early as 1950, again, 1300, but again, white person's Spanish surname, and it's not really disaggregated until a later point. And then you also have the question of who do you consider within this pantheon of who's considered Latino. For example, Cape Verdeans, Portuguese may be
Yep.
considered a Latin language by
Yep.
some, and
Haitians.
yeah, and then but also being of African descent, right? So I think your
Mhm.
point earlier makes that a little challenging to figure out, but I think that's a great line of inquiry for local historians to and other people interested in that history to work to find out and learn more about.
I mean, Haiti itself is really a really interesting kind of case study. I mean, first of all, I think part of the reason why this month is so-called Latino Heritage Month is because you have, a number of revolutions that were sparked around this time. So people automatically in California will think of the 16, septiembre, right? That's the Grito de Manuel Hidalgo. But coming up on the 22nd, I believe it's the 22nd or the 26th, is coming up is Grito de Lares, which is the Boricua uprising. Well, guess what? All those uprisings were inspired by who? By Haiti, which happened in August. You know what I mean? Which is why Black August, has so much significance, right? For many, many reasons. George Jackson, Soledad Brothers, so many other reasons we won't get into, I guess, today, but hopefully someday y'all get into some of that some of that history because it's very much linked to our Black liberation movements as well. And
Mhm.
there's so much multiracial organizing that happened in the prisons during that time. And I think that's happened here in the Bay that really needs to be sort of acknowledged. But, but going back to my original point,
Yeah.
Haiti inspired that. And now you go and literally half the island is the Dominican and half the island is Haiti. And what's the distinction made? French versus Spanish, those are both Latin-based languages, right? So are Haitians Latino? And what's the other distinction? It's phenotype. So light-skinned Afro-Latinos, Dominicans would be lighter, and those who are more of, who are less mixed but darker phenotype and more prominent sort of African physiognomy features and all of those things in Haiti. You know what I'm saying? And so it's really just kind of absurd how these identity politics unfold. You know what I mean? I don't know why we continue to kind of subscribe to some of these sort of colonial constructions so much.
Well, I imagine some of it has to do with some of the benefits that are conferred based
Yeah,
on.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I think we know the answer to it. I guess it was a
I
rhetorical
appreciate a
question.
rhetorical question every now
Yeah.
and again.
Yeah, but I guess to my point is anybody who wants to think of themselves as being progressive and really not a bigot, like we should really be challenging these some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the challenges with challenging some of these ideas, some of these narratives, is perhaps a lack of knowledge. And so I'm curious, for yourself, what was some of your process of learning about some of these different, I mean, and these histories are like wide ranging, right? Like it's not just one local history in this city, county, state, but what you've begun to speak about is global. And so I'm curious, if you could just share about some of your process of learning and sharing.
Yeah. I guess I'll begin with my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother, grew up in a time where embracing your indigenous identity um, was almost unheard of. You know what I mean? Um, and yet she did. And she really taught us to embrace it as well, you know. And so, that was already something that was kind of planted in my mind. And and I think for many of us, I think for a lot of Black and Indigenous and people of color growing up through public education, there's so much erasure. We're so kind of invisibilized, you know what I mean? And then that even if you don't know what the truth is, something in your belly tells you that something's wrong. You know what I mean? Like, I think, even as a young person, I knew that I rebelled against the system that I perceived to be inherently adverse to me. I just did it in a way that was fratricidal. I rebelled and fought against other men who looked like me. You know what I'm saying? But and so there was no political objective. There wasn't that politicization. That part, I think, is what's very dangerous, and I think that's part of why we see the attacks on critical race theory, right? Because what it does is it begins to hold European settlers and their descendants accountable for the dehumanization, and for all the crimes that they've committed. And what it also does is it ignites a social, political, racial consciousness in those that they've oppressed, and it challenges white supremacy and narratives that reinforce, produce and reproduce white supremacy, And so there's a vested interest in erasing that and keeping us ignorant, and and sort of enticing us, with the so-called carrot and a stick. I've never liked that, whether it was really applied to sort of like education, you know what I'm saying, or miseducation rather, or whether it was ceasefire in Oakland, you know what I'm saying, as a criminal justice policy. Because gang labeling, as we know too, is something that is really racial profiling camouflage under the guise of crime prevention, because we don't see people talking about Aryan Brotherhood and all these white supremacist gangs and white national groups, Proud Boys, as gangs, right? But yet we have gang enhancements. Has any DA in this nation used a gang enhancement and applied it to any white supremacist group? If anybody knows of anything like that, please let me know, because to the best of my knowledge, that has never, ever happened. And yet I got homies who basically got criminalized based on their zip code and got gang enhancements and are doing a whole lot more time than they should, than they should be doing in this criminal injustice system based on gang labeling.
Wow, thank you. I definitely want to come forward in time in a moment and talk to you about the work that I believe led to you co-founding CURYJ, and the work related to the enhanced the gang junctions in Oakland, I guess about a decade ago. But back on this sort of political education. So you started with whether your
Yeah,
grandmother.
yeah. My grandmother, man.
So I'm curious from that, her boldness of reclaiming that identity, where did it exist at all within the school system, or was there something else that was also maybe community oriented that
Yeah.
contributed to the educational process?
So what I didn't share with the folks who are joining us is I'm formerly incarcerated. At the age of 17, I was arrested and charged with multiple felonies for my involvement in a drive-by shooting, and I was very fortunate to not be charged as an adult. That's a whole nother story and presentation in itself. And at the age of 19, I found my way in community college, searching for something to hold on to. I didn't necessarily know what, but I began by taking ethnic studies classes. So Dr. Zelty Crawford at the College of San Mateo. I was from San Francisco. When I went to City College, I seen all my boys out there slinging D, trying to pop off at women. I'm like, man, I'm gonna get caught up again. I'm gonna get distracted. I need to go I need some distance. I went to Skyline College, it's still a little too close. So finally I settled at College of San Mateo. There was enough distance. And that's actually where I learned the history of Los Siete de la Raza, because a number of those guys were actually College of San Mateo alumni. A number of them were actually involved in a student organization at the time, a militant one called COBRA, which stood for the Coalition of Brown Race Activists, right? And were involved with the Third World Liberation Front. You know what I mean? They're in College of San Mateo, and some of them were involved with state and other places, City College. But right there at the College of San Mateo, Dr. Zelty Crawford, the chair of the department, had been the first chair of ethnic studies since the Third World Liberation Front, and had not retired yet at that time. And so he provided me some canons, of ethnic studies. So I'm reading Frantz Fanon, I'm reading Alfred Memmi, I'm reading Paulo Freire, you know what I mean? And there actually were no La Raza classes at the time, man. There was just sort of general ethnic studies, there was African-American studies, there was even Asian American studies, but there wasn't any Native American studies or La Raza studies. And so, basically he supported me in basically putting together a proposal to the instruction committee at that time, to get a class articulated and to develop, some of those classes that have been on hiatus. They used to have them and they've been on hiatus for about 25 years. So I learned about, presenting to an instruction committee, learned about UC and Cal State articulation. I went and I met with folks. And what I was doing was just reading. I was reading when I was locked up. I was reading when I got out. I could not read enough. I stopped reading fiction books, and pretty much the books I read for the next 20 years, for most part nonfiction, hard, but I was just thirsty, man. I was just soaking it all up. And I ingrained myself in the movement. So the people who I'm reading about were people who were involved in these movements. I'm hanging out with Dolores Huerta just shortly afterwards. First thing I knew is like, Cesar Chavez is somebody who's supposed to be important to us. I don't know why, because that was never taught to me. So I went and joined the United Farm Workers Solidarity Committee in the San Francisco Mission. And I think on my second or third meeting, there's Dolores Huerta. And at the time I'd been reading up, trying to learn more about it. I'm kind of like starstruck. I'm like, oh my God, you know what I'm saying? So that was cool. I'm hanging out with folks like Angela Davis, because I became a part of the Critical Resistance Organizing Committee in 1997 as an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley. So not only am I hanging out with Angela Davis, I'm up at her house having living room discussions, planning for this conference beyond the prison industrial complex, and me as a formerly incarcerated young person in that space, you know what I mean? And as a young scholar at Berkeley at the time. So, Elizabeth Petite Martinez was somebody who came from my neighborhood, man. She lived right there on 24th, and she was the author of, the 500 years of Chicano history and pictures, you know what I mean? And so, and I should share too, I'm not of Mexican descent. I'm an acculturated Chicano straight up, you know what I mean? I think it's probably hard not to be growing up in California you got brown skin and a Spanish surname. And I fully embraced the identity, and I fully embraced, Chicano culture, man. My uncles were homies, they were cholos, you know what I'm saying? But my roots are actually South American indigenous. My grandmother was Quechua, from Peru. My father's family is from Colombia. And my grandfather was English Scottish, from my maternal grandfather. And so, I fully, embrace, Chicanismo, and have always been embraced by, in the Chicano community and circles. But, I think it's important to kind of point that out, because sometimes I see a lot of my other folks, man, and they're like, man, that's just a term for, for Mexicans, like La Raza or Chicano. But, I never felt that way, man. You know what I mean? I always felt included, but, each to their own, and respect for whatever makes people feel comfortable and included.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that one of the things I want to connect and ask about when you talk about movements that may be specific to one group, like Chicano may be understood as being Mexican specific, and there was also aspirations of making it wider or maybe more inclusive, right? Or that being your experience. And so you mentioned the Third World Liberation Front. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that, and particularly, if not focusing on some of the Chicana element of it, or just the issues around solidarity in those movements.
I think that here in the Bay Area, the Third World Liberation Fronts were very much an exciting time that really promoted multiracial solidarity in which you had an Asian American movement and Asian Pacific Islander students, you had Black students, you had Chicano Latino students, you had First Nations, Indigenous students who came from, tribal communities, within the context of the US, or urban natives, right? All banding together, man, to rebel against this system of oppression and white supremacy, particularly in how it was reproduced in the ivory tower in higher learning institutions, right? And demanding a space. And really it was born out of student struggle as part of a quest for, for social justice, right? I think what it's evolved into has been frankly unfortunate. While there's certainly some exciting things that have happened, it feels like when we talk about assimilation, the whole spirit of really translating theory into praxis and it really being applied research and about really like creating popular education, and doing research, not just for research sake, but to really advance our community and our movements, got kind of lost. And it feels like ethnic studies, both generally and within all of the disciplines that kind of fall under that umbrella, in this day and age, is trying so hard to legitimize itself as a social science that there's just a whole lot of intellectual masturbation that sometimes takes place. Not everybody. There's some really exciting and there's some badass scholars. And what's really seems to be an unfortunate trend that I see time and time again is the most badass radical scholars of color, the ones who are most committed to students, the ones who are most committed to praxis, are the ones who get denied tenure over and over again. There was certainly a wave of some radical scholars who were hired. So one of my mentors, Carlos Munoz is a good example of that. But another one of my mentors, Robert Allen, like that people oftentimes talk about publish or perish in academia. Robert Allen was one of the best, most widely published, scholars, and he was never ever promoted to a tenure track position. He was an adjunct lecturer for his entire career. He wrote Black Awakenings in Capitalist America. He wrote the Port Chicago Mutiny. He wrote numerous books. He was the editor of the Black Scholar Journal. Publish or perish, that was just straight up racism. And frankly, even within our own departments, from our own people, sometimes there becomes people who become insecure, and the people who are more assimilationist, the people who become the ones who get promoted.
Wow, that's a breakdown right there. I think it was the poet Marvin X. He said Black studies went to college and never came home.
Hey, that's real. Yeah, that's real. Marvin hit it on the head, man. Hey, man, you want to give me a moment just to put on a light, brother? I feel like I'm disappearing from the screen.
Yeah, I was gonna say, he's disappearing into the Bay Bridge. And,
yeah. Give me 1 sec.
Yeah, it's all good. We'll take this moment. Actually, I want to do a poll with our folks here that are present. And so I have a poll which just asks you a couple questions about your connection to the Alameda Museum, as well as a little bit about yourself. And so folks can just take a quick moment to respond to these 6 questions. So the first question is, if this is your first time attending an Alameda Museum event. The second question is, if you're a member of the Alameda Museum. The third through 6 questions are questions just about demographics, but also where you might be joining us from. And so if you all can take that moment to just share. And so I see folks are already breezing through this really quickly. And so in a few moments, I will end this poll, and then we'll return back to George with the Luz, with the Noor, with the light. And so again, I want to thank you all for joining us for this Latino Heritage Month program with George Galvis, again, the Executive Director of Communities United for Youth Restorative Justice, or CURYJ, an Oakland-based group which focuses on working with young people with the injustices, or with the impacted by the justice system. So I'm gonna end the poll really quickly and also share the results so folks can see. And so most of the people that responded, this is their first time attending an Alameda Museum event. Majority of folks are not members of the Alameda Museum. And I'll definitely be dropping that link in for encouraging y'all to join. As far as who's present, most of the folks present are over 25 years old, and we don't have any people who are under that age. And then a range of people of different identities, including one not listed. And just to go to where folks are at, have a lot of folks outside of California, as well as folks elsewhere in California, and then folks from Central Alameda. And just as a special shout out to our folks joining us from Langston University in Oklahoma, two alumni I think that are connected to Alameda, as well as I think maybe this conversation. First, the pilot Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman, first African American woman and Native American woman pilot, and there is a home in on Alameda Point for survivors of domestic violence named Bessie Coleman Court, and of course the professor Nathan Hare, who was a part of the movement for Black Studies and Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, which led to on strike, San Francisco State longest strike that led to ethnic studies there, was an alumni at Langston as well, and somebody that's just a treasure to be able to connect with here in the Bay Area. So with that little intermission, when you're ready to rejoin us, George, I think we can get back into, if not some of the local, any more local history you might be interested in sharing, but some of these other questions that are coming up. And again, just want to remind folks you can add questions to the chat and we'll make sure we come down to them. So maybe this might be a moment to sort of fast forward to these part of how I think I met you, or actually no, I met you before that, but I actually want to talk about the issue around gang injunctions in Oakland, and particularly both your understanding of that and your involvement in that issue.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah, I was gonna say it, but I know you get it.
Yeah, you knew it was coming. Good looking out. So I was gang labeled as a young person. I was on the database, on the gang file of several Bay Area counties, which is why I'm really adamant about abolishing the G word. Like I said, for me, gang labeling is just racism camouflage on the guise of crime prevention. Some neighborhoods, they have Boy Scouts. Some neighborhoods, they have Little League. And some of us, all we had was our hood, our neighborhood, and don't criminalize me because of my zip code. Now, if you want to focus on the behavior, that's cool. I ain't mad at that. Let's focus on the behavior and let's not criminalize people just based on their zip code and who their friends are and that kind of ridiculousness. You know what I'm saying? So, and we know that it's arbitrarily applied. I know that because I'm also, I'm a proud Golden Bear alumni. And so when I transferred to UC Berkeley, I was so proud to be at the #1 public university in the nation. And if anybody thinks it's University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, you could just get off the thing right now. You know what I'm saying? It ain't, man. It's UC Berkeley, y'all. So I was so proud of being a Golden Bear, man, that I participated in an annual ritual, which is the big game. And at that particular year, it happened to be held at Stanford. And I remember going, and just so you know how proud I was rocking blue. And if you knew my neighborhood, you know that was a big deal for me at the time. You know what I'm saying? So I'm rocking my Cal Golden Bears colors. I'm there. And I'm just, I've always been an observer. And so I'm peeping things out and I'm like, wow, okay. So over there, Stanford, they're wearing red. Over here is UC Berkeley, we're wearing blue. And I witnessed a lot of the same type of stuff I saw in the neighborhood. I saw underage drinking. I saw the use of controlled substances. And at the end of the game, I saw some fools in blue and some fools in red throwing elbows, big ass crowds, and, getting into all kinds of fights and skirmishes. It was treated fundamentally differently. Why? Because they were white boys in so-called fraternities, right? But the police definition of a gang is 3 or more individuals who come together and are involved in any kind of criminal activity, right? Were those fraternities, were they gang labeled? Was there gang enhancements? It was treated fundamentally different, is that they weren't even arrested or placed in handcuffs, man. It was like, these are just unruly, overzealous fans. They just got herded back to their frat houses or their dormitories. And, That was it. You know what I mean? And I was shocked because I thought, man, if that went down in the neighborhood, even at like a high school football game in the neighborhood, there would have been a riot squad. There would have been a police occupation of our neighborhood. And I've seen it before because I recall when there was a fight at one high school in San Francisco, the fight had already ended. The police showed up and they proceeded, and it became a police riot. The police proceeded to beat up every student, any teacher who got involved and tried to intervene, got beat up by the SFPD. It was just a full-on police riot. This happened at Woodrow Wilson High School back in the day. You know what I'm saying? And so so gang labeling to me is like, get the hell out of here. I was actually doing a lot of consulting. I was providing training and technical assistance to tribal youth programs, tribal juvenile detention reentry, and the 7th generation tribal mentoring program at the time when the gang injunctions in Oakland were imposed. I was on the road all the time. And the person who called me, man, we were just talking about earlier, Rashid. So I need to just give a shout out to, one of our Bay legends, youth organizers, who's preparing to make his journey home right now. He's got full-blown cancer. It's terminal. And he's only got we don't know how much time, but he's only got a little bit of time left with us, right? And that's Brother Tony Coleman. So Tony Coleman was the founder of the Third Eye Movement, probably one of the architects of hip hop organizing. Tony used to take like rap verses and turn them into like chants and rallies and slogans, you know what I mean? So Tony had been my homie, man, forever, you know what I mean? We were both folks who grew up in Frisco. We were both formerly incarcerated. We both, as a result of displacement and gentrification, ended up in Oakland in the 90s. And so he called me up and was like, hey, man, I'm over here at City Hall at the Public Safety Committee meeting, and they're trying to impose a gang injunction. There's like 100 police officers here. And the only community folks is like me and one other person. So I said, man, I'm on my way. So I shot over there. I lived like it was like a 5-minute drive, pulled up, walked in, and sure enough, that's what I saw. And at the time, Oakland Police Department was really trying to, they were trying to get these gang injunctions approved for these John Does. So what they were saying is that they were going to arbitrarily impose them on whoever they wanted. They see somebody walking the neighborhood, they're like, okay, gang injunction. And what anybody who doesn't know what a gang injunction is, like, I understand we all maybe have fears about, gun violence and safety and all those things. But what a gang injunction is it criminalizes non-criminal behavior. It's like a restraining order. But now you have a restraining order from being in your own neighborhood, maybe associating with your own family, maybe even associating with your own friends. And you're criminalized for being in your own neighborhood, and non-criminal behavior becomes criminalized. So in the Fruitvale gang injunction, if you just said what's up to somebody else that was also in the gang injunction, boom, you're both locked up. I witnessed it on a Cinco de Mayo. As soon as the gang injunctions got imposed, one homie said what's up to another homie, boom. Another person from one of the defendants in the Fruitvale gang injunction was arrested for having a red balloon at their child's birthday party. They arrested him at his child's birthday party. OPD came in and flipped, and they're out there always looking for something. And they turned up this one dude's house, and then they decided to go ahead and bust him for having a red towel, because red was one of the prohibitive things in the gang injunction. So we were wasting valuable public resources and criminalizing people for non-criminal behavior. That's the problem. It's fundamentally wrong, and yet fear politics can be extremely powerful. And what we know is that all the empirical research and evidence has demonstrated that gang injunctions actually don't improve public safety. You know what I mean? They're excellent tools for displacement and gentrification. And in most cases, in neighborhoods where they begin to impose, gang injunctions, typically crime goes up. And that's exactly what happened in the Fruitvale and in North Oakland when they imposed it. Why? Because any sort of service providers, resources, opportunities, and programs that those people are, all of a sudden, most of these folks were funded by the city. They were told by the police and by the city not to provide service to them anymore. They were also you take someone who's isolated and someone's detached. Now you further isolate, you further detach them. You don't really give them very many options. You're forcing them into the underground economy. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So yeah, Brother Rashid, I was really grateful for you, for your partnership, and everybody who came and joined with us as part of the Stop the Injunctions Coalition. I put out a call right after that. We had our first meeting right there at the Eastside Arts Alliance, pulling together anybody who seemed to care, that we thought would care about these issues. And we started Stop the Injustice Coalition. And my organization, CURYJ, was born out of that organizing, to really center the leadership of those who were directly impacted. So my co-founders were the defendants in the Fruitvale gang injunction, right? And the city wagged their finger and tried to call them the worst of the worst. They tried to pathologize them, call them bullet magnets, and all kinds of other things that were very dehumanizing. And the brothers who were part of that gang injunction were able to absolutely disprove all of those labels that were placed on them by our former police chief, Anthony Batts, and our former city attorney, Anthony Rousseau, who tried to build their political careers and profit off the Blacks and criminalizing Black and brown young people. So our guys who were defendants of the Fruitvale gang injunction, they identified, a vacant lot in which there was just a whole bunch of dumping, illegal dumping, and blight that had occurred. And they said that their vision for their community, because we asked them, well, what is your vision? And they wanted community gardens, they wanted murals that reflected our culture and our history. And so, we decided, well, let's support them in making, in their vision for the community. Well, that one spot right there, we did the research to find out, well, who's the slumlord that allowed all this blight to happen in the gang injunction zone? When we did the research, it was the city of Oakland. How hypocritical, right? And it was the homies that they labeled the worst of the worst who cleaned up their mess, who picked up the garbage, cut the weeds, hauled away all the old tires and refrigerators that had been dumped there, and turned it into a vibrant community garden and community building space, and painted murals there. And we began to continue to paint murals, And so, yeah, man, that's a little bit about the gang injunctions. What y'all should know too is we were the very first community organizing effort in the nation. So you from the East Bay, you could take a little pride and pop your collar. And we were the very first community organizing effort in the nation to fully defeat a gang injunction. As of March 2015, all injunctions were lifted. All cases were dismissed as a direct result of our community organizing efforts.
Thank you for sharing that, George. And just two interesting points. I recall writing, I think I was writing for this website, Oakland Local at the time. And I remember an interesting moment where folks were rallying outside related to one of the gang injunctions. I don't remember if it was Northside Oakland or Fruitvale. But at the same time as that rally, there was an auction happening around the corner, because that's where the county property auctions would happen. And this was during the foreclosure crisis. And so in both of those neighborhoods, there were a lot of people who had lost their homes, and a lot of conversations about, displacement and gentrification in those two communities. And then the other thing I just shared briefly, Russo became the city manager in the city of Alameda.
Well, y'all should be real proud.
So I want to encourage folks. I have a couple more questions I want to ask George, but I want to again give an opportunity for folks who are present to ask questions. And so, in this conversation, you covered a lot of different ground related to one, the identity politics. So the identity label of Latino, what that means, and how it is used to erase African and Indigenous people, and also some of the organizing and demands from some of those movements, as well as some of the different local history, your own politicization from grandma to being incarcerated to organizing with other young people found in an organization. Thinking of young people and that work you've done in the town, I want to ask you about something else closer to home in Alameda. And so I believe it was April 19th of 2021 here in Alameda. Mario Gonzalez was murdered by the Alameda Police Department. And we know there's murder because that was also confirmed by, I believe, the coroner's office.
Yep.
And so you've been involved with supporting Mario Gonzalez's family, the Alante family, and curious if you could just talk a little bit about what happened, as well as some of the organizing effort that's taken place since that time.
Yeah, man. I mean, Rashid, you laced me up too on a lot of the history, the racist history of Alameda police, right? It wasn't all that long ago that there'd been, a whole lot of other stuff that was uncovered and just kind of swept under the rug, particularly anti-blackness, right, and racism, from Alameda police. And so, yeah, Mario Gonzalez was tragically murdered by the Alameda police. They have yet to be held accountable for that. In a very similar way to the way that George Floyd was murdered, right? You can see through the body cam footage that they pressed their bodies, their full weight of their bodies on, on him. And all he was doing was sitting in the park and having a beer, man, in a paper bag. He wasn't hurting anybody. He wasn't bothering anybody. He wasn't harassing anybody. He was just sitting in the park having a beer. And some Karen, I don't know what it is, Alameda, why y'all attract so many Kens and Karens, man. But you really need to like come for your cousins. You know what I'm saying? Some Karen, called the police. And what I would really encourage folks to do is like recognize that when you call the police, particularly on a Black or brown person, you are potentially putting their life at risk, straight up. So these little benign things that people are involved in or not, or just living, you know what I mean? Calling the police, because you see somebody drinking at the park, man, that ended Mario's life, and that forever changed his family's, his family forever, man. Mario was the caretaker for his brother. He has a brother with severe autism. And Mario was a caring, loving brother who took care of his younger brother. He had another brother, Jerry, who was at college, his mother, Esther, and, really relied on his support, to support, his brother with autism. And so it's not an uncommon story. And kind of, I hope that everybody, in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, is sick and tired of being sick and tired. But for all of you who are from Alameda, all of you who live in Alameda, the Alameda Museum, where you all can really leverage your agency as residents, as an institution in Alameda, to really hold police accountable and to create a fundamental shift in the culture of Alameda, and this sort of, de facto sort of, well, it's basically it's racism, but by de facto, what I think I was trying to say is de facto segregation. De facto segregation in Alameda, it really needs to end. Mario lost his life because of it, and we are still fighting for justice for Mario. His brother, as you can imagine, has a lot of PTSD. He recently reached out and is asking for support, to get it, linked up to a culturally competent therapist where he's going to college, you know what I mean? And his mom, like, can you, I can't even imagine as a parent losing my child, let alone losing my child in that particular way, you know what I mean? And so I know some people feel very reluctant to sort of embrace defund the police. They don't understand what that is. Maybe the expression scares them. But I do think it's important to kind of think comparatively in a social historical context, you know what I mean? And really understand the roots of prisons and the roots of policing in the so-called United States. And so the very first prisons in the context of the US were the slave plantation. The very first, and the reservation. And the very first police were, the slave patrols and the cavalry. If you were a person of African descent enslaved in the plantation and you left the plantation, you would be hunted, you'd be brutalized, you'd be possibly killed. If you were a person of indigenous descent and you stepped off of the reservation, you'd be hunted, you'd be brutalized, and you'd be possibly killed. How do we reform that? We don't reform that. We have to dismantle systems that have caused trauma and harm, and we have to replace them with opportunities to heal, grow, and thrive. And so I fully support, entities like the Department of Violence Prevention in Oakland, and the way that there's been investment in building positive community connection and leaning in to support our most vulnerable children, youth, and families. In Alameda County, we have a $2 billion reserve, the very second largest in the entire nation. You know what I mean? And in Alameda County, we spend $32 million a year to incarcerate young people. Well, the average daily attendance in our juvenile justice center in Alameda County is basically down to about 50 young people for the last 2 years. So if you do the arithmetic, super basic, that means we're spending $667,000 a year to lock up our young people who come from the most vulnerable families in our county. So anybody should feel livid, whether you're directly impacted by this issue, you know, in terms of just the misuse of our public resources, our precious public resources. So when we say defund the police, we actually want public safety, but we want to address root causes. And if we invest in spaces and opportunities for young people to heal, grow, and thrive, one will fundamentally improve the life trajectory of those young people and their families. It becomes very much like a domino effect. You know what I'm saying? Two, we will address root causes of crime and really promote authentic public safety, because trying to basically incarcerate or police your way into public safety is an oxymoron. It's akin to trying to bomb your way into peace. And lastly, I don't think we'll need to spend $667,000 a year per young person. I think we can actually spend a lot less. So it'll be cost savings, but we have to invest in the infrastructure. And that's basically, like, to rewind, like CURYJ, my organization, was born out of the gang injunctions. And we were very focused on not just what we were saying no to. We said no to gang injunction zones that criminalize particularly Black and brown young people, but yes to this concept of youth empowerment zones that we've evolved now into what we're calling youth power zones. And so we have a permanent home being constructed. If any of y'all cruise through the Fruitvale, right there on East 12th and 35th, you'll see construction happening. The first floor of that affordable housing development for families, which will be 181 units of 100% affordable housing, one of the largest affordable housing developments that we've had in decades in the city of Oakland. That first floor, we are going to have effective ownership of. It's a 99-year lease on city land. It's interesting how the city gave away land for free, to private developers. And now all of a sudden, when we're trying to do something for public benefit, we get the 99-year lease. But in real estate terms, it's still effective ownership, right? So we have effective ownership of the first floor commercial condominium, and we've named it for Oscar Grant. We're calling it the Oscar Grant Youth Power Zone at Fruitvale Station. Oscar represents the young people we work with, man. He was a 22-year-old transitional age youth, a young father at the time that he was murdered by Officer Mesley on the Fruitvale platform. And immediately, law enforcement went to the typical playbook that they always do, right? And they tried to weaponize the fact that he was previously incarcerated to rationalize the irrational, defend the indefensible, and we say never forget and never again. So we want to talk about Black and brown solidarity. My organization reflects the diversity of Fruitvale. We work with multiracial youth, but predominantly we're working with a lot of young people who would be identified as quote unquote Latino, right? And Uncle Bobby, Oscar's uncle, and Mama Wanda, they want to change the BART station to honor Oscar's legacy with his name. And they were told by Fruitvale BART administration, oh, well, the Latino community of Fruitvale would never accept that. They'll never let that happen. So they called us up and we're like, ain't nobody asked us. Shoot, I work with all the homies and the OGs who are the official mayors and shot callers of their neighborhood on the street. You know what I'm saying? And so, so we showed up for the family and we got the unnamed street named Oscar Grant III Way right there in front of the Fruitvale BART station. We rolled up and pushed up on the administration along with Oscar's family to get them to come up with the resources so we could contract with one of our community artists, Reefa One, to paint a memorial, a giant portrait of Oscar right there at the Fruitvale BART station. And now we've committed to naming our space, the Oscar Grant Youth Power Zone at Fruitvale Station. And we're going to come for a name change for Fruitvale. We'll see what it ends up being, but maybe it's, Oscar Grant Plaza at Fruitvale Station or some other form of that. But they said the BART administration said never. I love it when people say never. You know what I'm saying? And we're going to make them eat those words. And for me, part of that is an example of multiracial alliances and authentic Black and Brown solidarity. You know what I mean? And I also want to emphasize that Latino, once again, isn't necessarily all brown. You know, Latino is a multiracial identity. You have Chinese influence, you have Middle Eastern influence, you have African influence, you have Indigenous influence, and yes, we got some of that colonizer influence too. You know, and so it's an ethnic identity. Many of us embrace the identity that we've been able to trace our own families to. I saw one of the questions was like, how do you embrace an Indigenous identity without, you know, let me go back and take a look at the question.
Oh yeah, I can bring that one up.
Yeah, because of gatekeeping, right? Well, what I always encourage people to do is, like my elders told me, you don't really know where you're going unless you know where you've been. You have every right to trace your tribal lineage by beginning to look and explore and see what regions of wherever your family's from, if it's, you know, El Salvador, if it's Mexico, if it's Peru, and begin to really do that research, your own genealogical research. And it's also important to have humility, like recognize, like all of a sudden you don't become super indigenous, you know what I'm saying? And you get to just walk around with the cape and try to tell everybody else what's up, like you're the expert, you know what I'm saying? Like have a little humility, recognize that we're all learning and there's a progress. And as you learn more and more, you'll be able to speak with, you know, a little more authenticity, but always acknowledging that you're learning. As my elders also say, as long as you're green, you're growing. As soon as you're ripe, the next stage is to rot. So that's my best advice in terms of how you begin to, you know, search your own identity, participate in the community, you know, begin to search out and reconnect to wherever you're able to find your tribal lineage. There might be small, you know, coalitions of, you know, indigenous folks who reflect your traditional tribal, you know, your original tribal nation or where you're from right here in the Bay. You know, maybe if you're from Guatemala, there's a Mayan Mum community, there's a Yucatec community, there's a Mixteco community, you know, there's so many different communities. There's a Quechua, South American indigenous community, connect with them. Go there with humility, try to learn, you know what I'm saying? And then there's also an intertribal community. And so I've been very, you know, blessed and fortunate to be a big part and involved with our intertribal community. So, you know, I attend powwows, I participate in a lot of ceremonies and have really embraced those ceremonies that, you know, have helped me reconnect to the core traditions and values of my own people, but, you know, but our ceremonies from here, right?
I wanted to ask you one question about one of the ceremonies, but first, you mentioned there was a Karen who had called the police, and just I believe it was actually a male who called the police, and he said that Mario was not doing anything wrong. He's just carrying my wife. So related to the ceremonies, there was some ceremonies that happened at the 2021 protests that took place following the death of Mario, or the murder of Mario Gonzalez. And I was hoping you could clarify what some of those either the rituals or ceremonies that took place.
Yeah, so we brought in our Mexica Danzantes, Aztec dancers, to come to bring some of that spirit, to bring some of that blessing. You know, I'm part of a Teochpae. It's a ceremonial circle group in South Dakota. You know, the Wasuka Rattling Hell Woman Teochpae, Porcupine Pine Ridge Reservation. I participate in what's called, you know, the Sundance ceremony, pipe carrier, and so, you know, I participate in Sweat Lodge and all of those things. That's been part of my healing journey, is reclaiming, relearning. And I was basically mentored, you know, when I got out of my incarceration. I didn't really mention this, but I got embraced by a lot of veterans from the American Indian movement. You know, so one of the guys from the American Indian movement was a custodian at my community college at College of San Mateo. And, you know, he reinforced the same thing my grandma told me, but I was still kind of doing this own sort of self-otherization. He's like, "You're Indian." I said, "Well, no, man, I'm Latino." I'm like, "Well, yeah, you're right. I have some, I have indigenous blood too. I'm Quechua. My grandma's Quechua, you know, but it's different." He's like, "Why?" And then I had to scratch my head, and I was like, "Well, because of these borders that were imposed by the colonial invaders." Oh shit, you're right. Why? And so, you know, he brought me into, you know, and introduced me to the Inipi, to the Sweat Lodge. That became a big part as I'm learning ethnic studies, that became a big part of my healing journey. You know, to the Oinwan Wichapi, you know, Sundance ceremonies, to, you know, taking me to powwows and just becoming a part of the broader sort of intertribal community, going into roundhouse with, you know, big head dances, you know, the big times, which are more California social dances, you know, bear ceremony. So I just started participating and just kind of soaking it all up, man. And there's this very vibrant intertribal community. And what you'll find when you become a part of it, or if you are a part of it, is that there's a lot of kind of cultural exchange that happens. Like that's always been the way. And so as you learn things, you know, you can share, you know, there's this sort of exchange that happens, man. You know, and what I have yet to do is kind of go back and really be able to kind of learn, and that's part of my bucket list, man. You know, I'm planning to take some Quechua language classes. They offer them through UC Davis, online, some different places. Go back and reconnect with, you know, some of my people out there in South America. But we have what's called an Intirami, which is a Sundance ceremony out there, Quechua way, right? It's a very different kind of ceremony, but the same concept. And the one thing, like I've worked a lot with tribal communities, I've been very much a part of I served as the vice chair of the Intertribal Friendship House, is that having traveled and having had the benefit and the privilege of sitting with many, many cultural keepers, medicine people, traditional folks, is that the core teachings, the values are consistent. Everyone has different rituals, language, ceremonies, even within the same nation and within some same communities, people have different ways. Well, this is how we do it, or this is how this is, you know what I mean? There might be some slightly different variations, but the core, the essence is consistent. So in many ways, what, you know, I've always felt is I've become much closer to my own ancestral ways and teachings by participating in the ceremonies here, you know what I mean? And just been privileged to be welcomed in. I think the most important thing is when you've been welcomed in is to always recognize that you're a guest and could come in with humility, you know what I mean? And never try to feel like you have ownership to really, like, you know, try to lead and run shit, you know what I'm saying? Like just always have that cultural humility about it, you know?
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. And Joshua, thank you for that question. I have two last questions I want to ask you. First, George, have you been to the Alameda Museum before?
Never.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you were able to participate in a virtual event, and although not at the physical museum. I'm curious, thinking about you know, what you just shared about this recent history, what you know of the longer arc of exclusion in Alameda. Uh, what might be ways that the museum, if it isn't, could better represent some of this history that you've spoken about?
Yeah, man. Well, I think that, you know, I think that there's a racial reckoning that really needs to occur, man. And Jim may not like it, and you know, that's all good in the hood. Jim, you know, go kick rocks. You know what I'm saying? Um,
Jim has already kicked rocks.
yeah,
He's
yeah. So good riddance. Don't let the door hit you on the way out, Jim. But what I'm saying is that, you know, this, you know, like people need to basically ask themselves this fundamental question. Do you want to live in honesty? Do you want to live in truth? Do you want to be a good person? Um, or as long as you benefit, as long as you're in a position of privilege, are you comfortable with the oppression of other people? And I really hope that it's a resounding that people want to be good people. You know, I mean, I really hope, you know, that people find their moral center in humanity, right? And you know, and it cuts across, man. Like we know not all skin folk are kin folk, you know what I mean? We see, you know, sellouts in the Black community, in the brown community, in every community, right? Um, and so people can certainly operate sometimes out of self-interest, or will go against, you know, the interests of the group in order to personally profit. And that's really kind of unfortunate, but I still have to fundamentally believe in this idea of being humane, right? And of doing right, and of this common human spirit that, like, you know, when I talk about white supremacy, like I hope like the white folks don't take it personally, man, because it's not necessarily personal. I'm talking about whiteness. I'm talking about white supremacy. And what I'm really, you know, trying to also recognize is like the pain that's caused white folks too. You know what I mean? Like whiteness is another construction that happened here in the United States. You know, like think about Irish and Scottish folks who were oppressed by the English. You know, the Queen just passed away. There's been so many interesting kind of, responses from that, right? And it's come from some, unlikely resources. Like it ain't just Black and brown folks who've been colonized by the Queen of England. Like the Scottish, the Celtics football club, right? Soccer team, right? Man, they had a big protest. You know what I mean? Like we ain't celebrating the Queen, right? These are Scottish folks. For Black and brown folks in the US, like we're scratching our heads. We're like, well, those are white folks. Well, man, you have no idea what they did to the Scottish for thousands of years. You know what I'm saying? And so this sort of assimilation and this construction of whiteness that occurred in the US. And the truth of the matter is there's probably a pain and there's probably a trauma for those who have benefited from white supremacy and colonialism as well, that frankly, everybody needs some healing, you know what I mean? And some restoration, but there's not a shortage of resources. I feel like there's this scarcity culture, scarcity mentality. It's not a shortage of resources, man, but there's definitely some serious greed. Like during this time of the pandemic, the last 2 years, we saw billionaire wealth triple, you know what I mean? And we see our most vulnerable folks, particularly people of color, right? People who were hanging, who were right on the edge are now hanging on a thread, or the thread already broke. You know what I mean? And so, how can, like at the risk of sounding cheesy, because it ain't easy being cheesy, like we really need to embrace the power of love, man. Love is a powerful energy. It's, it's transformative, it's healing. And we got to love on each other, man. We got to love on each other. And that means we can hold people accountable, but we can hold people accountable with love.
Yeah. Right on, George. Well, I really appreciate you for taking time to share with us a range of history, interrogating the identity that's known as Latino, some of the local history in San Francisco, as well as moving to more recent history in both Oakland and Alameda. I want to just share with folks really quickly some of the upcoming events. So, of course, today around Latino Heritage Month, again, September 15th to October 15th, we had George tonight. And again, he is co-founder and executive director of Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice, CURYJ, and I encourage you all to check out that organization. So we have a few more upcoming events in this series. So next month on the third Monday, we'll have a workshop about our exhibits at the museum. And so I encourage folks to go in on these upcoming weekends, so Saturdays and Sundays, and check out the Alameda Museum at 2324 Alameda Avenue near Park Street. And while there, check out the displays and the exhibits and join us on the 17th. And we're going to have a conversation about what we like about our museum and what we may be able to improve. And then the following month, actually on a Thursday, we'll have a representative from the Confederated Villages of Lishan Nation, Karina Gold, who'll be talking about local history of Indigenous folks here and what's known as Alameda. And that'll be a part of Native American Heritage Month. And then lastly, to end the 2022 series, perhaps on that theme of love, we'll be having a conversation from hate to love and beyond, talking about place names in Alameda. And some folks may recall in recent Alameda history, what was once Henry Haight Elementary School was renamed to Love Elementary School. So we'll be talking about place names, and that'll be myself, along with current editor of the Alameda Post, Dennis Evanowski, who's also former president of the Alameda Museum. And so still got George here, who may join us at our exhibitions workshop, but we really want to encourage you all to join. And again, tell us what you think about the current displays and how the current displays can be improved. And if you are not a member of the Alameda Museum, we encourage you to join AlamedaMuseum.org, AlamedaMuseum.org. So again, appreciate you, George, for taking the time to share. All of you who are present now or watching this video at some point in the future, and y'all are welcome to add some love in the chat, claps, hearts, whatever you are feeling. Almost add a boxing glove and not love. So I'm gonna just stop right there. So again, thank you, George. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Brother Rashid, for the invitation, for having me, man. And I'll just say, to your question about have I ever been to the Alameda Museum, I guess for a lot of reasons, that we kind of discussed and other reasons, I've never really thought of Alameda as a welcoming and embracing place. You know what I mean? For folks like me and you. But what I will say is I'm really grateful to your leadership. And, and frankly, as a result of your involvement, man, like now I'm kind of inspired. Like maybe I'll go to the Alameda Museum and see a reflection of things that, engage me, you know what I mean? And not just the gems of the world, you know what I mean?
Thank you again, George, and thank you all for joining us this evening.
Right on. Thanks, everybody.